Welcome to the Noir Poise podcast, where wisdom is power is more than just a motto.
It's our way of life. While we don't claim to have all the answers, we're dedicated to delving deeper into different topics through meaningful conversations. As a duo, we bring different viewpoints to the table, enriching our joint journey towards growth and poise.
Join us as we explore and unlearn to relearn while striving to navigate life with poise.
When it comes to communication, in your opinion, do you think there's a right way to communicate and a wrong way, or does it always vary?
I think it always varies, but there's distinctive wrong ways, in my opinion.
Because I read that there are 5 communication styles.
Mm-hmm.
First, assertive, which simply means assertive communicators express their own needs and desires, ideas and feelings while also considering the needs of others.
Mm-hmm.
Aggressive communicators express their feelings and opinions in a way that violates the rights of others. This style is often categorized by speaking in a loud, demanding, and overbearing manner. Passive communicators often fail to express their feelings or needs, allowing others to express themselves more. They tend to avoid conflict and do not get their own needs met. The passive-aggressive style involves expressing negative feelings indirectly rather than stating them openly. And lastly, the manipulative communicators are skilled in influencing or controlling others to their own advantage. Their manner of communication may be insincere with a hidden agenda behind the spoken message.
Right. And there's actually a lot more communication styles than those 5, but those are the typical major ones, 4 to 5 of them, because manipulative is mentioned in some areas while sometimes it's not. But yeah, I feel like there's many different styles. I get that they like to put people in categories and boxes, which is why my answer was, I don't think there's necessarily a right way to communicate, but it's very obvious when there's a wrong way to communicate. That's my opinion, though.
One of the things that I thought about while reading these communication methods is it seems that most people would say they fall into all of these brackets.
Yeah, I think it depends on the situation, who you're communicating with. Myself, I do feel like I fall into different communication styles depending on the situation and the individual I'm communicating with and how comfortable I am with that person. So I can see how that can be true for many. I wouldn't say falling into all of them. I think we have the capability to fall into all of them, but I do think that we all have foundational ways of communicating that comes naturally to us where we don't have to think about it too much. And it's just our direct way, our natural way to communicate with others.
Kind of like love languages where if your love language is time, that doesn't mean you don't enjoy acts of service or gifts.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know what you'll think about this, but I actually read that the correct method of communication is being assertive.
I heard that too. I've heard that before. And I can see why, because it's the most stable one. If you read all the other characteristics of the different type of communication styles, they all have some form of negativity to them.
Yeah.
While assertive, I think out of all of them sounds a little bit more healthy. So I can see that.
I think I personally fall more so in the passive and passive aggressive communication style.
Mm-hmm.
So naturally, when I saw assertive being a communication style, I automatically assumed it was something negative.
That's funny. When I first heard assertive, I naturally thought it was direct, just straightforward to the point, no sugarcoating, because for a long time, I actually thought I was assertive and I'm not. I don't think I fully understood what assertive communication style was until I read the details.
And in your opinion, how would you describe it in your own words?
Assertive, now that I've read about it.
Right.
I think it's being respectful and having boundaries while still communicating exactly what you feel in the moment, at the moment, rather than internalizing things and it coming out in a different form. So that's what I would take it as now.
I struggled to understand how being assertive was the best communication or the right way, as they put it. But it wasn't until I read a quote from Tony Robbins that said, to effectively communicate, we must realize that we are all different in the way we perceive the world and use this understanding as a guide to our communication with others. That quote helped me to understand that being assertive doesn't mean it's my way.
Right.
Being assertive means giving grace and understanding that I may see things one way and I could be right. You may see things another way and you can be right as well.
Perception.
Right. It's all about perception. Being someone that's more so on the passive side, I naturally believe that the right method of communication is to sometimes hold your tongue.
That's interesting. I agree with that. I agree that when you're emotionally mature, you know when it's important to hold your tongue and when it's important to vocalize things. We just recently talked about that, where in communicating with people, sometimes you have to know when to speak and know when you have to be silent. So I don't think that necessarily makes you passive.
But according to this definition of being assertive, is, at least it's my interpretation, an assertive communication style, even if the other person is vocalizing what they feel, you still find the ability to vocalize how you feel. Whereas I feel that passive communication is more so, if you're telling me how you feel, at the moment, I'm not going to say anything. It doesn't matter what I feel.
I don't think that's passive. I get what you're saying, and I can see why that can be misconstrued. Assertive, based on what I've learned about it, was more so your responses are coming from a place of self-confidence. So due to the self-confidence, you don't feel the need to get disrespectful or prove a point because you're confident. Whereas passive, I didn't read this anywhere or learn this anywhere, but based on what I gathered, this was my opinion pertaining to passive. It's actually the opposite, where you lack self-confidence, and that's why you tend to take the route that pleases others or puts others' emotions and situations before yours. So I don't think it's necessarily about knowing when to hold your tongue or not. I think it has more to do with, in the moment of expressing, it's coming from a place of self-confidence versus it's something that you should be expressing, but because of your lack of confidence, you're not expressing.
One of the detrimental things that having a passive communication style has brought to our relationship is me giving the impression that everything is okay, but it's not okay. I don't remember when I had this epiphany or when it all finally hit me, but I do remember thinking how unfair it is for you to, in a sense, be misled, thinking that everything's okay. Me never having a problem with certain things. And my personality, I don't have a problem with a lot of things. But because I'm more of a passive person, the things that I had a problem with, I just ignore them, let them go until I couldn't ignore them anymore.
Right.
So I had to realize that my passive communication often turned into passive aggressive, which then led to a conversation that showed that a lot of things that you thought I was okay with because I said I was okay with,
Right.
I wasn't really okay with. And it was unfair to you. I had to realize that. And just
it takes a lot of maturity.
Yeah, it does. And kind of like what we said about the whole love language, that to the core, you love what you love, or you love to communicate how you want to communicate. I think to my core, it could just be how I was raised or my environment. I'll always be a passive person, but I had to train myself to be more assertive, be more vocal, not because I wanted to, but because it was unfair to you.
That's actually hilarious because passive communication is often people pleasing. And you tend to put the other person's needs before yourself. And the fact that you're saying you decided to change or at least try to change your communication style because you feel like it was unfair to me kind of illustrates passive communication.
That's an interesting
or at
take.
least passive behavior or characteristics. So that's hilarious to hear you say that. I see what you're saying though. And I do feel like communication styles similar to love languages has to do with the way we were brought up. In addition to, of course, our natural personality and who we are. But a lot of these things stem from different aspects of our life, right? Experiences, environment, how we were trained, and then who we are to the core. So communication style, in my opinion, absolutely comes from a part of it comes from how we were brought up, in my opinion. Because for me, when I finally realized what my communication styles with an S were, I had to recognize that a lot of it stemmed from how I was raised and how my mom communicated to me and how I was communicated to, because I then learned that behavior and how to do it with others. But then at a certain age, you have to take accountability, regardless of what you were taught or how you're used to things. You take accountability and make alterations where needed. And I heard this quote about communication that said, communication style is a choice.
Really?
Yeah, I read it and I was just like, oh, really? Literally what you just said. I was like, a choice? How so? Because originally I thought it's who we are. It's how we communicate. But we've been learning this over and over. All of our behaviors, for the most part, are learned behaviors. And that's why we get to a certain age when we realize, oh, shoot, I have to unlearn certain things that I have learned before because you're realizing some behaviors may be toxic. And I think it's similar with communication styles that we often pick up certain things as we are growing up, whether that be from witnessing and watching our parents communicate or whether we disliked the way they communicate, so decided to go the opposite side of the spectrum. But point is, a lot of our behaviors are learned. And I say this based on experience because, like I just said, I feel like my communication style was actually learned because I would find that depending on who I'm communicating with or what environment I'm in would determine how I communicate. So if I'm in a comfortable setting, it may be one type of style. In a professional setting, I was often labeled on a different type of communication style. So I feel like it really depends. And for a long time, I was in denial, to be honest with you. And I think a lot of us tend to be in denial on what our communication styles are because we have this image or belief in our mind of how we do things and who we are until someone else tells you and you're just like, wait a minute, really? And as I did self-reflection and started to pay attention to my behaviors and take into consideration what other people say, I then realized that my communication style was stemming from a lot of negative behaviors that I was indirectly taught or that I learned from watching or whatever the case may be.
One thing I learned about people, and this goes into communication, your style, is your brain is wired to keep you safe. So if you'll feel safe being aggressive, like you're protecting yourself, then
it's
that's
a defensive mechanism.
Right. It's a defensive mechanism. Same way my communication style, I feel safe when I'm able to just
internalize
and let the other person speak, because then I know at the end of the day, I'll always be happy with myself and I can always work things out internally and not have to worry about what the other person thinks externally. So it's interesting that you said how our communication styles is formed growing up, because we're literally grasping at all these different experiences and information and saying, okay, how can I remain safe, or how can I be safe? If it's vocalizing myself so that the situation could improve, that's what I'm going to do. If it's holding everything in and internalizing, then that's what I'm going to do. But the main thing that I had to learn as far as being passive is it's all about managing expectation.
Explain.
So I had to learn that there's nothing wrong with me being passive itself, but the error is in how I'm managing the expectation from you. So, for example, if I'm saying that if we're supposed to go out somewhere and deep down inside, I don't really want to go out,
Mm-hmm.
but the passive side of me is saying, you know what? Let me
Suck it
just
up.
go out, suck it up. What would be the correct way is to let you know that this is not something that I'm really enthusiastic about, but I'll love to go if you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I read something that I thought was simple but effective. It says a little communication goes such a long way. If you're busy, say it. If you're upset, express it. This got me. If you're running late, let people know.
Mm.
If you don't want to do something, be straightforward. If you're unsure, ask. It's so simple, but so important. The running late part is what really got me. We've all been in a situation where you're relying on someone
Mm-hmm.
to be there at a certain time and they show up maybe an hour late, 2 hours late, and they come to you with such a story. And from their story, you can tell, okay, you could have told me this
Right. Way in advance.
way in advance. There's no problem that you're late,
Mm-hmm.
but you could have told me this way in advance so that I could have prepared myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I had to learn with being passive. Is not really about what I have to say, but explaining myself in a way where the other person can be better positioned.
Mm.
So that's what I mean by managing expectations. I was so focused on how am I going to make you feel or how am I going to make people feel that I wasn't thinking that me not vocalizing something early on is now putting this person in a bad place. So now when I'm ready to meet up, guess what? They've been waiting for me for 2 hours or they're so inconvenient now. And I also had to realize that part of the discussions or the debates we've had in the past, when I didn't vocalize and everything may have come out all at once, is you weren't necessarily about what I had to say. You were upset at the timing
Right.
of it. So,
I'm laughing because, yeah, that's the gist of most of our debates was just like, so why didn't you say that then? Why do you wait like 6 months later and bring it up now? So I'm glad that you realized that.
yeah, so that's what I mean by it's all about managing expectations. So,
Mm-hmm.
if we're both on the same page about how each other feel, believe it or not, I don't necessarily need to understand you and you
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily need to understand
Right.
me. But when the time comes and that understanding is met, we would have been on the same page the whole time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does.
And just like I'm mentioning how essentially time is wasted, I actually read that a lot of money is wasted because of poor communication as well.
I agree.
A study conducted by Grammarly and the Harris poll highlighted that poor communication costs U.S. businesses an estimated $1.2 trillion
Mm-hmm.
a year.
Yeah, I believe that.
That is insane.
Yeah, that is insane. And I feel like that's the same situation that occurs in relationships when you communicate poorly. Because, like you said earlier, we now have a misunderstanding of what the situation is. And even if we don't comprehend where each other's coming from, but at least if certain things are vocalized, then you're aware of those situations, if that makes sense.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I know for me personally, even at work, this figure is speaking about just U.S. businesses, but there were several times when I had to communicate with someone and I totally misunderstood them or they totally misunderstood me.
Mm-hmm.
And I might have spent a good day or a good week working on something only to find out later that no, I misunderstood them.
Mm-hmm.
So I take that and relating it to just personal relationships. I can't imagine the amount of time and effort
Mm-hmm.
that's wasted just based off of poor communication
Right.
alone. And when I say poor communication, I mean people not being on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest issues is assuming
Yeah.
that you understand someone.
And that's the thing with communication for me. And you may think I over communicate. Do you?
Over communicate? No, you just ask a lot of questions.
Over communicate.
I don't think that's over communicate.
I'm not saying it in like a negative
Actually,
way.
no, you do over communicate. Because I'm thinking about, let's say you're going to take care of something and you need something done. I know for a fact I'm going to receive an encyclopedia of text messages.
Yes.
And even your sister knows that she's going to receive an encyclopedia of text messages, and we're going to look at it like, wait, what? Why does it have to be this long?
And that, not saying that that's correct, but what I've learned with communication is the aspect of assumptions. A lot of times in communicating with people, especially people with different communicating styles, there's a large room for assumption. So I rather over communicate, in the sense I rather ask questions that I feel like I know the answer to, but I'm going to ask you anyway, so you can then clarify what the answer actually is. You're laughing, but I'm dead serious. I rather reiterate myself 2 or 3 times. So when we get to the place where something should have been done, whether that's on my part or the other party's part, it's been communicated. So if it's not done, maybe you were forgetful, or maybe you chose not to do it, but I know I did my part. That's how I look at it.
In your opinion, would there be any flaws in over communicating?
Absolutely. I'm sure there is. It can be mistaken as nagging. But when I over communicate, I try not to do it in a way where, at least I try not to do this anymore. I try not to do it in a way where I make the person feel less than, but I can see how that may be the case, or how someone can receive that message in that way. So that would probably be a negative factor, because I know when I over communicate with my mom, she takes high offense to it. She thinks I'm literally just saying she's not doing a good job, or she's...
It's belittling.
Yeah, like it's belittling, basically, which is not the case, but it's just to make sure that what I need done is going to get done, or that whatever it is that you're getting ready to do, you comprehend what I stated. So there's no room for confusion. That's my thing, honestly. And that could be because of how I was brought up. I just mentioned my mom. But that's one of our issues, where I clearly say something and she does the complete opposite. So in situations like that, I've learned over time, okay, I'm going to reiterate myself multiple times in different ways so you fully grasp what I'm saying. And it may come off a little extra, but sometimes I'll ask the person just to reiterate what I just said. And I do it the other way around too. If someone, for example, if you're saying something to me, I will reiterate what you just said to me. I'll be like, just so I'm clear, you want me to A, B, C, D, rather than hearing you and walking away from it. But at least we have some form of closure in the conversation. There's some summarization, so we both know what's happening. So for me, I feel like over communicating is a more of a benefit than it is an issue, but I can see why people would find that annoying.
I read that the 4 type of communication issues that really destroy any type of relationship is being defensive, contempt, stonewalling, and criticizing a partner's personality.
Interesting.
Because I think the main issue with communication is one person is trying to say something and not necessarily listen.
Right.
And the other person is doing the same thing. So we're both talking, saying, you see my point? You see my point?
Right.
And I'm not trying to see your point. You're not trying to see my point. So it leads to further argument and debate. So do you think, or instead of asking, do you think, how do people find a common ground when their communication style is so different?
Yeah, I think you just said it. But to start, I would say be knowledgeable, because many people don't know that there are different communication styles. They just know that their communication is not effective, or they have communication issues, but people don't stop to have empathy and comprehend how the other person communicates and what their perception is, if that makes sense. So I feel like making yourself knowledgeable of the communication style that you yourself have through self-awareness and self-reflection, and then paying attention to the communication style of those around you, making yourself knowledgeable, like we're discussing now, knowing the characteristics of certain communication styles will then allow you to know how to approach someone, in my opinion. But generally, common ground should be when communicating, you need to listen and not listen to respond, but actually listen to what the person is saying. If you do that, I feel like it will lead you to more effective communication. So, all in all, I think you should listen, be clear in what you're saying, because sometimes people aren't clear and concise in what they're saying to the other party. And the person listening is often waiting to respond to what they're saying. Ego gets in the way and they want to prove a point, or they're not as compassionate as they should be. So I would say, one, listen. Listen to listen, not listen to respond. And then when responding, don't respond to make yourself feel right, or don't respond to invalidate that person, but validate what they're stating and then provide concise, clear responses.
What about for situations where people feel like I'm 100% in the right?
We talked about giving grace, right? So I feel like a situation like this, where you know you're 100% in the right, just because you're 100% in the right doesn't mean that you have to prove yourself right. And I think that's where the self-confidence comes in. If I'm confident in knowing that what I'm saying is accurate, at some point in time, I know whether you see it now or later, you're going to see it because I know I'm right. So I don't have to be egotistic or prideful to prove that to you in the moment. But in order to communicate effectively, I can state my clear, concise facts and points. And if it's not being received or perceived the way that I'm giving it, then at that point, I have to be emotionally mature enough to know when to give grace and step back in order to have an effective conversation.
The one thing I would like to add to that is the moment you think you're right, you're probably in the wrong.
Interesting. What makes you say that, though?
Because no one's perfect.
True.
So,
but there are times people are right, though.
There are times people are right, but when I say no one's perfect, I mean whatever situation that's the topic of discussion, you could always learn from.
Exactly.
So you can never be so right that you can't learn from whatever the other person's saying. And
Facts.
Even if you're debating something where you know, like, nah, this, I'm clearly right. I have, whether it's scientific proof or whatever it is, then I believe you have the opportunity to learn why that person is saying what he or she is saying.
I agree with that.
So that's why I say whenever you think you're right, that's the moment where you need to step back and say, okay, what could I learn from this experience? Or what could I learn from what my partner or my sibling, my friend, or whomever it may be is saying right now?
And when you understand the communication styles and you're knowledgeable about them, and you start to pick up how someone communicates with you, you then know when to back down. Because, like, if you're dealing with someone who's aggressive, you know their main priority is to prove a point, right? And because you know that, now your approach is a little bit different. If you know someone is naturally passive and they're a people pleaser, I'm not going to approach you the same way I would approach an aggressive person, because I know you're more likely to just take what I'm saying and let it go. So now I may be more inquisitive in our conversation to make it more effective. So that's why it's necessary to comprehend all the different type of styles and then identify that in your partner. Identify those characteristics within them so you can understand why it is they do what they do. Because so many people get into arguments with loved ones and they don't know why. They're like, why are we always arguing? Like, why can't you see my point? Or why can't I understand where you're coming from, kind of thing? And I think it's because of the lack of knowledge. Again, it's the lack of knowledge of understanding how their communication style, what their communication style is and where does it stem from. So I think that's also important to figure out as well, is not just, oh, you're aggressive. I read this and this is what it is. You show characteristics of aggressive communication style, because no one wants to hear that. But taking the time out to also understand where that aggression comes from. Why is that person aggressive? Is it because they grew up in an environment where their parents illustrated aggressive behavior, or did they grow up in an environment where their parents disregarded what they felt and what they said, so they felt the need to be aggressive to defend themselves? Like there's different things that come into play, and being knowledgeable of that is important. And I think that's the only way you can fully understand your communication style, the communication style of others that you communicate with on a regular basis, and then applying that into your relationship with them.
I think I could speak for the both of us when I say our communication drastically improved once we started learning more and more about each other's upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
When we just have discussions on how our families handle things growing up, and when you got to be around my family more and I got to be around your family more, it really helped us understand, oh, I see why he is the way he is.
Right.
I see why he's so passive.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see why she's a little bit more vocal.
Mm-hmm.
There's a scripture that I love that says, it is the goodness of God that brings people to repentance. And I love that in this context because it's your goodness towards someone that's going to allow them to communicate more effectively with you. So instead of me going to you and saying, I read that you have an aggressive personality, let's work on that. If I show some kind of compassion and try to understand where you're coming from, doesn't mean I have to understand, but try to understand where your loved one is coming from, you'll be surprised on how more effectively your communication with that person will be. And just like that scripture, it's you being good to them. It's you not judging them and pointing your finger and telling them that they have to change. Their communication style is not effective. That's going to improve your relationship. I actually read from a survey by yourtangle.com that said 64% of respondents identified communication as their primary reason for divorce.
Yep.
Naturally, when we hear about divorce, we think infidelity, we think some kind of money issue, or like they would say, the love is not there anymore. But 64% of people said poor communication or communication problem was the primary reason for
I
divorce.
often think that, and this isn't just my opinion, but I often think that the lack of communication or effective communication can actually lead to things like infidelity and so on and so forth. Because when you don't have effective communication in your relationship, someone's going to end up feeling lonely. Not validating and saying that it's not also an internal thing, because people who do deal with infidelity or people who do cheat, it tends to be an internal thing. But at the end of the day, the lack of communication causes so many different issues. So there's no surprise why people are always saying like communication is key, right? And while communication is key, because you can communicate, people tend to think that communicating is literally just saying how you feel. That's not the only aspect of communication. In communication comes understanding. In communication, there's also empathy and compassion. In communication, you have to also have grace. Like there's so many different portions that fall underneath the bracket of communication. So it's not just, well, I'm saying how I feel, but you have to do the work to fully comprehend how you communicate, where some of these foundational issues are, and then do the same for the people that you are communicating with.
There's a quote that I love by George Bernard Shaw, and it says, "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." So just like you were saying, where it's not just about, let me tell you how I feel, and just walking away from there, but ensuring that both parties are on the same page.
Right.
So like you just said, sometimes communication is speaking, sometimes it's just listening. But the point is, you need to do the work to ensure that before the conversation ends and before you walk away, both of you are on the same page.
Right.
And again, on the same page doesn't mean I agree with you 100% or I understand you 100%, but it means that both parties had the opportunity to say what they're feeling, and they gave each other the opportunity to say what they're feeling or experiencing. And in the process of trying to improve communication, I think it's also important to note that things may seem like they're getting worse before they get better.
Right. There's going to be a lot of obstacles.
There's going to be a lot of obstacles, such as you're going to feel hurt.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to bite your tongue a lot.
Right.
You're going to feel misunderstood. You're going to feel frustrated, but that's part of the process, unfortunately.
Right.
You have to go through this kind of trial period before everyone comes out on top.
Exactly.
I'm sure there are several situations where you tried to tell me something, maybe I wasn't willing to listen, and you had to humble yourself and say, you know what? I'm not going to say anything else. I'm just going to let him learn on his own.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? When I learn on my own, we have a conversation about it.
Right.
And the beautiful part about that is it improves our communication.
Right.
You're not forcing me to learn, but you're kind of giving me a heads up so that when I do learn, I can say, oh yeah, she did say this,
X,
or
Y,
she,
and Z, yeah.
right. And with communication between people, I think it's extremely difficult to lower your ego, lower your pride. But it's definitely necessary. I know people
Yeah.
don't want to do it, but if you want to take your relationships, again, this is friendships, this is even coworkers, to be honest with you,
Yeah.
parents, siblings, no matter who it is, if you want to take your relationship to the next level, you have to learn how to humble yourself and always keep in mind that you don't know everything. You don't have all the right answers.
Yeah.
And you have to allow some grace for the other person to learn on their own.
I love that, especially the part where you talk about your ego, because I think that's one of the main issues that people deal with and don't recognize it. A lot of times we respond in a type of way or we have a certain reaction and not recognize that it's stemming from our ego. One of the things we talked about and we had to learn is, again, giving grace and being humble and putting the mindset of, I want to prove a point or I want to be right, because that's something I struggled with in the beginning. Was I always wanted to be right. Who doesn't want to be right? I always wanted to be right. And I had to recognize that it's not always about being right. And one of the things that I learned was focusing on purpose rather than passion. And what that means to me is, while you may be passionate in the moment to express a certain emotion or a certain thing that's occurring, have the mindset of, what purpose will this bring, or what benefit will this have on my relationship in the future, and what benefit will it have in the conversation at this moment? And that's something I told you. Now I try not to vocalize things if I don't see a benefit from it, rather than just expressing things just to express it, because I think that's what a lot of people do when communicating, that they think like, I got to let it out. I got to say it. I got to say it. Not everything needs to be said. And it takes a lot of mental strength or emotional maturity to recognize when things should be said and when things don't have to be. And the question that I ask myself when conversing with people in order to help me make that decision is, what will that statement or that question do in this moment to that person and for the future of this relationship? And if there isn't any benefit, let it go. You have to put your pride aside and just let it go. Even if you know what you were about to say or express is something that's right in your eyes. But like we said in the beginning of this episode, everything is perception. So while I may think it's accurate and I'm 100% right, you also think you're 100% right. And the reality is we can both be right. Mm-hmm. In our own way. It's perception, and there's always room for growth. So putting your ego aside is number one, in my opinion, and focusing on the effort of things rather than the outcome. So we say this all the time. It's all about the intention behind what's being said, and in having grace on someone, especially when communication styles is a huge issue and you're dealing with someone who has a different communication style than you. When something is said that you may not like, reminding yourself that this is a loved one and their intention is not to hurt you, like we always say. So focusing on the effort of them trying to improve their communication style with you rather than the current outcome. And I think that helps with the whole giving grace aspect, as we've been discussing.
I think two things that can immediately be done to improve communication between two people is, first, stop being defensive.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I struggled with in the past. I literally vividly remember you telling me that I'm very defensive. And in my mind, I'm thinking I'm not defensive. I'm just stating my point of view. I didn't see it as defensive, but over the course of many years maturing, I started to understand that that was being defensive
Mm-hmm.
and how frustrating it is for you to go to someone and say, I didn't appreciate that you did X, Y, and Z. And although I felt sorry for doing whatever it is that you would mention, my immediate reaction is, let me explain to her so that she knows that I didn't mean to hurt
Mm-hmm.
her, instead of just saying, I'm sorry I made you feel that way and
Right.
I'm going to learn from it. And I think that's an immediate step that could be taken in relationships, where if someone comes to you with a complaint about something that you did or how you made them feel, don't try to defend yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Have a conversation that focuses on not why you did what you did, but how could it improve in the future? How could your reaction or that situation improve in the future? The second thing would be to stop criticizing your partner's personality.
Mm.
I think that one of the things that naturally turns people off is when you approach them and you're telling them all the wrong things about them.
Right.
They naturally want to be defensive. They naturally want to defend themselves and maybe point out flaws within your own personality.
Mm-hmm.
If you stop these two things, if you stop being defensive and stop criticizing your partner's personality, instead try to understand them, I think you will notice a major difference between how that person approaches you and how that person reacts when they're being approached by you. I think we can all think of at least one person where the moment we see their call or they're going to say something to us, we naturally get
Tense
on
up.
edge because we
Yeah.
know from
Experience.
history, from experience, that they're probably going to say something negative to offend you.
Right.
So imagine if you're in a relationship and that's how your partner thinks of you.
Mm-hmm.
If you change that, then guess what? They're going to want to talk to you
Right.
and they're going to want you to talk to them. So if you do these two changes, I'm sure you'll see some kind of benefit to it.
I love that you chose those two actionable takeaways, because I feel like that's actually what we did. Like you said, the defensive, I feel like, was more you, and the criticism was more me, where we both tried to apply that. And it has helped us tremendously. So I definitely know from experience that that will make a difference, because I've seen the difference that it made in our relationship. So I love that. And I second that 100%. I think that's definitely two simple steps that people can take to move forward. And I'll again just reiterate the importance of understanding the foundation of how one communicates, because once you understand history, it then gives you an idea of where the future will take you. Thank you for spending your time with us. We hope you gained some knowledge today that'll promote poise in your life. We have new episodes uploaded every Thursday right here, same place, same time. Until next time, you can follow us on Instagram at Noir Poise Podcast to stay connected. That's NOIRPOISED Podcast. We'd love to hear your feedback.
And remember, your wisdom is power.